Hey folks, so this video is going to be a kind of a power steering rundown on the Chase-based power steering reservoir, power steering kit, and high pressure hose that we sell. We want to talk about notable features, we want to talk about some install tips, and we want to do some light troubleshooting. And we might do a more expanded view on troubleshooting because that can get pretty in depth, but this should cover all the basics. So if whether or not you've purchase the kit or you're installing it, troubleshooting it, this video should cover everything. And of course, we're always there. You can contact us through the website to help you guys. We have great customer service, great, very knowledgeable staff. So if you get to the end of this video and you're still having issues, then contact us because we want to help you. So starting at the notable features, we'll start with the power steering reservoir. Fluid, this is at the heart of our kit, and this is what I think makes, beyond, everything adds up, but this is what makes our power steering reservoir the top selling product in our product line. We spent years developing this product here. So I assume that most of you guys don't know exactly how power steering systems work. So I'll give a quick rundown. You pour fluid into the reservoir. The fluid goes from the reservoir to the pump. It spins it out at up to 2000 PSI. It goes from the pump to the rack and then does its thing, makes it easier to steer, and then sends the fluid back to the reservoir. So it's just a loop system. There's very high pressures involved. The 2000 PSI is obviously extremely high, but the rack will use that and slow it down, but it's still extremely high. We've at an absolute high on a sprint car, we have measured 120 PSI return pressure. Your car is probably operating at 40 to 120 PSI max. So we use 120 PSI as our benchmark. If you think about pouring beer into a mug, if you just pour it straight in, it's gonna foam. It's gonna be complete foam. The same thing will happen if you just put fittings on a reservoir. So what we've done is we have created a baffle that is inside, it is this tall. It's a multi-staged baffle, and it slows the fluid down from 120 PSI return pressure to 12 PSI in that much distance. So this has been proven over and over and over for years to work lap after lap, or just in your normal street car. It can take it Formula Drift, rally, road racing, everything. It has been proven to work. No aeration, no spillover, unless, we'll talk about that later, the spillover. So this is at the heart of the kit, and it is what is the real winner of the kit, and what's going to really help you guys out. If you've used a stock reservoir enough, you know that over time it'll start aerating, it'll spill over, there'll be fluid everywhere, it'll get all over your fresh paint or your freshly cleaned bay. So this is going to fix it. So the next thing is the hoses. This stuff is equally as important and easy to screw up. Factory hoses are just rubber clamps and, rubber with hose clamps, and that only works for so long. And we even see situations where the high pressure hose or the rubber hoses over time will just sweat out fluid. And then that causes aeration because it's introducing air to the system. So this, even if you just have a stock car, this is gonna make your power steering system last as long as you have the car. So the fittings that we use are AN fittings or mil spec, and AN means Army Navy. So the military developed this stuff a long time ago, and if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for NASA, it's good enough for the motorsport world. So it's become a pretty common thing in the motorsport world, and we only like to use the best stuff out there, so that's why we use it. Plus it looks really cool. So one thing that we do that others are not doing is with our high pressure hose, we use a PVC coating. Years of experience have told us that just a raw stainless steel hose is completely detrimental to your car and really shouldn't be used. So what happens is, let's just say that this is installed on your car and it's pushing up against your intake manifold or your frame rail. One, that's gonna scratch the intake manifold or the frame rail. So if you have nice paint, it's gonna scratch it. And then, there's a lot of vibration under the hood of your car. And so over time, that's gonna vibrate and it'll puncture this hose. So when you're installing this stuff, it should be free and clear from any components. It should just go from wherever the respective location is going to. But if for some reason a clamp fails or something, you're gonna be good with this. Over time, if it's rubbing against a frame rail and cause issues, that's gonna make it last way longer. Plus it looks cooler. So the next thing that we do is we make the high pressure hose a swivel. As I mentioned before, this is a 2000 PSI, hose. So you can't use these standard swivel fittings on 2000 PSI. It would just bust the hose and it would bust the fitting. It would be a complete failure. So you have to crimp the fittings in place. And the problem with that is you get stuck with certain clocking. So we operate in 90 degree, 180 degree clocking. That's all good, but the problem occurs when you're installing this in your car. Let's just say that this is at the rack and this is at the pump. If it's routed like this, it would work, right? But if you want to dodge something, let's just say you're running a larger intake manifold and you have to route it like this, you can see that this is facing upwards. Or if you have a long hose and it's running across the car and you want to zip tie it to the sway bar because you have a larger oil pan, normally it would fit like this, so it would work. But when you go up forward and you want to mount it to the sway bar, this is no longer clocked correctly. So if you install a hose that's clocked incorrectly and you force it into place, that hose could eventually bust. So what we did is we just used this simple adapter. No one else is doing this. And if they do, they copied us. So we just have this simple adapter, and so you want to put it on your car, get it in place, tighten this one, boom, you have a swivel hose. So this is 37 degree flare, this is 37 degree flare. Everything's 2000 PSI capable, but we just add an adapter to make it capable of being a swivel fitting. Now, the feed hose. This is tricky, and I think a lot of people that would try to make a power steering kit, whether it be they're trying to make their own power steering kit, they're trying to compete with us. I don't want to give away all of our secrets here, but this would be hard. So dash 10 is too small to fit over the pump feed adapter on the pump. Dash 10 has to be stretched over, and we used to use dash 10. Dash 12 is too large. If you slip it over the pump, it can't clamp down right without leaking. Any clamp would be maxed out. It's not right. So what we ended up having to do is we got to a point where we could make a dash 11 hose, and dash 11 doesn't exist, but it's the size that a pump feed needs to be. So we invested the money into making dash 11 hose. The cool thing is that we can use dash 10 fittings. We just made fittings that have a bigger inner diameter, but it still uses dash 10 threads. Dash 10, really large AN fittings in general can get quite bulky. So if you use a dash 12, it would take up probably this much more real estate. And that's annoying. We're all fighting for space in our engine bays. So we wanted to make sure that we did dash 10, and it's an industry standard. If for some reason you wanted to mix and match some stuff, dash 10 is what everybody's using for a pump feed. So that was something that's really cool that we're proud of, is that this is a perfect fit hose. You won't have to stretch it over. We used to do this, and it was annoying, and we hated doing it, and our customers hated doing it. But it's just nice and seamless. It goes right on. The clamp works perfectly. And this was a cool feature that we were excited to introduce. I want to talk a little bit about some install tips, or pro tips, if you will. So the biggest thing that we get is we'll get people who mix up the hoses. They'll put the high pressure in the returns place, and obviously that's going to cause an issue. So I just want to run down where the hoses go in our kit, because I understand that when you're opening the box, it can look like gibberish to you. First thing is we pre-thread on the fittings to their respective locations. So when you open up the box and the packaging, you'll see fittings pre-threaded on to the hose ends. And this is just to make your job easier. So what I don't want anybody to do is take everything out and then take all the fittings off. That's gonna make your install harder. Probably gonna have to email us and ask us where everything goes. So when there's some cars that have different fittings that could connect to one another where you could swap it easily. But I would say 90% of cases, that's not gonna happen. So if you leave the fittings on, it's gonna help you a lot, because if it doesn't connect, square in a triangle, obviously it's not the right spot. So starting with the high pressure hose, this is going to be a shinier hose. It's gonna have the label on it. This goes from your pump to your rack. The next one is the other one that goes from the rack. It's rack to reservoir. It's the return fitting, the return hose. It's going to be nylon braided, and it's gonna have black ends on it. And it's gonna be the smaller of the two, of the one I'm going to show you. Wait, let me backtrack. If you get a cooler, the cooler just goes in between this. And the cooler hose will obviously be longer, but you just have to think of it like just a cooler is going in between this hose with two longer hoses. So it'll go rack to cooler, cooler to reservoir. And then the last one is the feed line. This goes from the reservoir to the pump. It is the largest hose in the kit, black nylon. In some situations, you'll have fittings on both ends, and in some situations, you'll have a clamp on one end, which we discussed previously. And then, of course, you have, we make a lot of brackets, so it's not gonna look like this one. But you have a reservoir and a bracket. We try to put it in the stock location. We might alter it to cater to different, whether it be turbos or intake manifolds, different things in the way. But in most cases, this goes into the stock location and then works with our power steering reservoir. The next one, and this is something that people screw up a lot, the fill point is halfway up the reservoir. So if you're looking down into the reservoir, it goes right here. During the bleeding procedure, it's gonna change around. If you overfill it, it's going to spill out of the cap just naturally. And if you overfill it slightly, it will probably spew out a little bit until it gets to a level in which it's happy and everything's correct. Something that we recommend is to get our reservoir cover, or any reservoir cover, put it over the top to where the elastic part of the reservoir cover is just right here. And we'll show you some pictures or videos, examples on our cars. If you do that, it'll keep the reservoir clean, and it'll obviously eliminate that spewing out into your engine bay. But if you overfill it slightly, whether you're at the track and your session's about to go, put the reservoir cover on there, and then you won't have to worry about any cleanup. But once, with a few days of driving or tracking, you can take that off and it'll stay clean on the top, which is a very, very good feature about our kit, because any stock reservoir is usually blown over. So the next is the bleeding procedure. With our kit, it controls aeration so much, and it modulates the flow so well that bleeding is extremely easy. All that I do on my cars is I fill the reservoir up halfway. With the car jacked in the air, I just turn it back and forth a couple times, turn the car on, turn it back and forth a couple times, and then check the fluid. It might go down, it might not. If it does, just add a little bit, and then just go drive. And it kind of goes back to what I was just talking about, where if there's any additional fluid that needs to be in there, it'll make its way out. And then that's it. I mean, I've experienced power steering systems that there's a whole procedure to it. It could take 30 minutes, the whole cycle. Generally, ours just instantly bleeds. If there's a hum from the setup and there's no issue, then usually if you just turn the car off, let it settle back down, check the fluid, by the time you drive again, it'll be good to go. The last install tip that I'm gonna give, and something that we see a lot, is Teflon sealant on fittings. I don't care what your mentor or your mechanic told you, you do not use Teflon sealant on AN fittings. The only things that get Teflon sealant are pipe thread, or NPT or MPT. Those are tapered thread and they do need sealant. none of our power steering kits will use any Teflon sealant. This, most fittings use a flare seal. So as soon as that's tightened down on it, that's going to give you the seal that you need, and that's good up to 2,000 plus PSI, so no sealant is needed. There's some situations where a crush washer is used, that seals that, and then some situations where an O-ring is used, which that takes care of that. So do not use Teflon sealant. So troubleshooting. First, I want to start with more mechanical failures, basically the things that can be associated with the pump or the rack, not the lines or the reservoir or the fittings, adapters, seals, all that stuff. Just want to start with pump or rack problems. So intermittent power steering is something that we occasionally see. This can be simply the belt slipping on your pump, and what you'll notice is that at idle it's harder to steer, and then as the RPMs go up, it's easier to steer. Sometimes the belt won't whine or it won't scream, but it is slipping. It's pretty easy to tell if this is happening. It might have oil on it. It could be a number of things. It can also be just simply pump or rack failure or a pump or rack going out. It's pretty rare that we see something going out. Usually power steering is just good or bad. So intermittent power steering, it could be the pump going out. It could be a rare case where the pump's just sometimes outputting the pressure it needs to and sometimes it's not. Or it could be the rack. Rebuilt racks will commonly show this. Even just the old rack in your car that's 25 years old or more or less. We should probably do a video that explains in depth pump and rack failures and how to troubleshoot that, but that's not what this video is. So we can kind of say the same thing about power steering not working at all. The pump or the rack can be to blame. That's if you have a bad rack or pump, that's what's usually going to happen. It just doesn't work at all. And it's important for us to say that these intermittent or complete failures are not caused by this stuff here. Not to take away from any development that we've done here. There's obviously, you can't just throw, like I said before, you can't just throw fittings on a reservoir and call it a day. There's so many things that can happen that I'll talk about in a minute. But this is, if everything is good in this regard, it'll work. This serves as a bridge. So intermittent issues or complete failures are not caused by lines or reservoir when it comes to chase-based products. Just like a bridge that you would see over a lot of water, it's important. The development that goes into that bridge is extremely important, and it can be screwed up so easily, but the development is done here and it's proven. And if there's no leaks and the stuff that we're about to talk about, if there's no leaks and everything's good, the reservoir is proven, it's serving as a bridge. So complete failure is not because you just put this new kit on your car. It's because of a pump or a rack. What we'll see with a rack is in a complete failure is even worse than just it not working. We actually had we were at a drift event about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and me and one of my team members was following closely behind, going around the track, having fun, and I'm not sure what happened. I think his rack maybe bent or something. Why don't you tell us?
Hey there, nice to see you guys. So what was determined to be the fault of the rack is, by the manufacturer when I sent it in for the warranty, was some of the teeth sheared on the inside of it, causing intermittent complete locked steering. So while I was in mid-drift, basically, my steering locked at angle, and when I let off the throttle, panicking like, oh, I can't turn the car anymore, I gripped up and went off in a ditch with my 59-year-old mom in the car. So it wasn't exactly a fun time.
Yeah, it was actually, maybe not at the moment, but it was pretty hilarious coming around a corner. We're probably showing the clip right now. Coming around the corner and just seeing Ryan coming at me at alarming speeds. I'd say that was a good memory of mine. And sorry for your loss in terms of your steering rack, but
It's okay.
that can happen. And we see, thanks Ryan.
No problem.
Oh. So what can happen with our kit is whining, and I'll explain how that can happen. So number one, whining is air, it's aeration or a restriction of flow. So with whining, usually you'll have aeration in the reservoir. So let's start there. So if the pump is whining beyond just a normal mechanical hum, and you have aeration in the reservoir, that means that the system is getting air before the reservoir. And if you think about the system, it starts at the reservoir, goes into the pump goes into the rack brings it back to the reservoir. So aeration in the reservoir means the system is pulling in air, or the pump or rack is bad. But in most cases, you're gonna see a leak. Aeration in the reservoir, you're gonna see a leak. That can be at the rack, it could be at the bottom of the reservoir. We pre-tighten these fittings here, but this is a ORB, which means O-ring boss seal. And if for some reason these aren't tightened all the way, it can pull in air there. If a fitting isn't tightened all the way, it can pull in air there. In most cases, pre-reservoir, bringing leaks in before the reservoir, pre-reservoir aeration is going to be very visible. You'll see fluid dripping out. One that gets challenging is post-reservoir aeration or post-reservoir whining. So let's just say that the pump is whining and there's no aeration in the reservoir. This is caused by something in this hose, if it's not a bad pump. So it can be, again, the O-ring seal on the reservoir, make sure that that's tight. This isn't tightened all the way, or this. So whenever you put our -11 hose on the pump and it's not tightened all the way, it won't leak. In some cases it will not leak, but it is pulling in air because this is a suction hose. So it's like an air intake on a car. It is pulling in at a pretty high pressure. It's pulling in fluid. So it won't leak because it doesn't have a way to, but once that suction occurs, it'll pull in air. So if you have checked the clamp and everything's good, you know it's not leaking or pulling in air from there. What we see very commonly is the O-ring seal on the pump feed adapter. In most cases, your pump will have some sort of adapter. It'll have a hose barb on it, or if you bought this product from us, it'll adapt it to a -10. Usually this O-ring is causing problems, or the factory car just can't take what you're throwing at it. We're slowly making this for all cars, and depending on when you're watching this, we could make it for all the cars that we cater to. Usually we see that this O-ring isn't a big enough O-ring, or the gap between the metal and the O-ring is too small, and so over time the O-ring is going to shrink, which gives the fluid a way to leak and pull in air. So that's that. If you've made sure that the clamp is good or the connection on this fitting is good, it could be your O-ring on the pump feed adapter. And then the last thing is on BMWs. They stopped, I believe, in '96 doing this because they found that it was a bad design. But on BMWs, they used a banjo adapter for the pump feed. So on the lower side of your BMW pump, you would see a banjo with a banjo bolt that goes to the larger hose of your reservoir. The problem with that is the banjo needs to have a certain amount of diameter on the hole, or a certain amount of total diameter on the banjo holes in the side of the banjo. If people will switch these, the threads on them are 16 millimeter, and people will switch these out with different banjos on their car. So if you have a banjo that has two, which would commonly be used for a fuel line, it has two holes that are pretty small, that's going to restrict your pump and will cause whining. We have a banjo bolt made that has 3 holes and they're kind of ovaled, and so that provides plenty of fluid flow to the pump. But if your reservoir is not aerating but your pump is whining and you want to test something before you throw pump or rack at it, check that banjo bolt for BMW owners. Check this O-ring. Make sure it's getting a good seal. And then that's pretty much it. No, you know what's gonna be funny? Is like the video that you showed us where they just disappear. Let me see like can you fast forward to the end of that? Where I'm just like, thanks, right? And he's just gone.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, let's do that.